Imagine being an English longbow bowman, the most feared soldier in Europe, the man who won a court in Sai. You've spent 20 years watching French knights die on your arrows, always at a safe distance. But now you hear thunder, and you realize it's not thunder, it's hooves. You look up and see 2-0-0-0 French cavalry charging directly at you, and your stakes aren't planted yet. Your bow isn't strung. You have nothing between you and those lances except 60 yards of open ground that's disappearing in seconds. You try to run, but there's nowhere to go. The last thing you see is a wall of horses and steel crashing into your friends. And then you're on the ground being trampled, bones snapping, screaming as hooves crush your chest and spine. This was the Battle of Patay in 1429, where French knights finally caught English longbow bowmen defenseless and slaughtered 2-0 of them in 6 minutes of pure carnage. For almost a century, English longbow bowmen had been the nightmare of French nobility. Since 1346, every major battle between England and France had ended the same way. French knights would charge bravely toward English positions, and before they got close, arrows would darken the sky. Thousands of arrows fired by expert archers who trained from childhood, men who could shoot 12 arrows per minute accurately at 200 YD. The arrows would punch through armor, kill horses, and turn charges into massacres. The French had tried everything. Better armor, different tactics, night attacks, avoiding battle entirely. Nothing worked. The longbow had made medieval cavalry obsolete, and French nobles had the scars and trauma to prove it. The longbow itself was a technological terror weapon, a 6-foot staff of wood that required a lifetime of training and incredible strength to use effectively. English archers started training as children, developing overdeveloped left arms and deformed spines from the constant practice. A warbow had a draw weight of over 150 lb, more than most modern compound bows. The arrows were 3 ft long with heavy bodkin points designed to pierce armor. At close range, they could penetrate plate armor. At any range, they could kill horses. And English archers were so well trained they could maintain rapid fire for extended periods, creating a continuous rain of death that no medieval army could advance through. The trauma of Agincourt still haunted France in 1429. 14 years earlier, 6-0 English soldiers had faced 30-0 French at Agincourt and won decisively. The French had lost over 7-0 men, mostly nobility, slaughtered by arrows and then finished off in brutal melee. The flower of French chivalry had been cut down in a muddy field, their expensive armor useless against the arrow's storm. King Henry V of England had become a legend. French nobles who survived carried the psychological scars, the memory of watching their friends and family die helplessly while arrows fell like rain. The longbow had broken something in the French military psyche. They were terrified of facing English archers in open battle. By 1429, England controlled most of northern France. The French king was weak. The kingdom was divided, and English armies were besieging Orleans, the key to controlling the Loire Valley. If Orleans fell, France would effectively be finished as an independent kingdom. French morale was at its lowest point in history. Soldiers deserted, nobles fought each other instead of the English, and everyone believed God had abandoned France. The English seemed invincible. Their longbowmen had won every battle for 3 generations. French commanders had learned not to attack English positions directly. The smart strategy was to avoid battle entirely. Let the English starve in sieges, harass their supply lines. But avoiding battle meant slowly losing the war. Then a 17-year-old peasant girl named Joan of Arc appeared and changed everything. She claimed God had sent her to save France, and somehow she convinced the French commanders to let her join the army heading to relieve Orange. Whether you believe her visions were divine or delusions doesn't matter. What mattered was that she gave French soldiers something they hadn't had in decades. Confidence. She told them they would win, that God was on their side, that the English would be defeated. And incredibly, the soldiers believed her. When Joan arrived at Orleans, French troops who had been retreating and avoiding combat suddenly became aggressive. They attacked English siege positions and won. They drove the English away from Orleans in a series of small victories. For the first time in a generation, French soldiers weren't terrified of fighting the English. After Orleans was relieved in May 1429, the French army went on the offensive. They pursued the retreating English forces, looking for a chance to destroy them in open battle. This was unprecedented. French armies had been avoiding major battles for decades because of the longbow's dominance, but Joan's presence and the momentum from Orleans had changed French psychology. The army was commanded by experienced nobles like Junot and La, tough veterans who knew how to fight. They weren't reckless. They were looking for the right opportunity. They needed to catch the English in a vulnerable position before the archers could set up their defenses. If they could hit the English while they were marching or unprepared, the longbowmen would be useless. On June 18th, French scouts located an English army near the village of Patay, about 50 miles from Orleans. The English force consisted of about 5,000 men, including 2,000 elite longbowmen under the command of Sir John Fastolf and Lord Talbot, both experienced veterans of Agincourt. The English were retreating north after their defeat at Orleans, moving cautiously through French territory. They knew the French were somewhere nearby, hunting for them, and they were looking for a good defensive position to make their stand. The English plan was simple and proven. Find high ground, plant wooden stakes to stop cavalry charges, form up the archers in lines, and let the longbows do their work. This strategy had won Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. There was no reason to think it wouldn't work again. The French had about 6,000 men, but critically they had about 2,000 heavy cavalry, mounted knights in full plate armor on powerful war horses. The French commanders knew that cavalry was useless against prepared longbowmen. The stakes and arrow fire would stop any charge, but cavalry was devastating against unprepared infantry. If they could catch the English archers before they deployed, before they planted their stakes and formed their lines, the cavalry could ride them down and slaughter them. Speed was everything. The French needed to find the English position and attack immediately before the enemy could prepare. They sent light cavalry scouts ahead to locate the English army, while the main force followed close behind, ready to charge at a moment's notice. The disaster for the English began with a stag. As the English army was marching in column formation through the woods near Patay, searching for a good defensive position, a deer was startled and ran through the English lines. Some of the soldiers shouted and cheered as the animal passed, a brief moment of entertainment during a tense retreat. But French scouts were nearby in the woods, and they heard the shouting. They immediately rode back to the main French army and reported the English position was just ahead. And critically, the English were still in marching formation, not deployed for battle. The French commanders realized this was the opportunity they had been waiting for. They gave the order to attack immediately, before the English could prepare. The English advance guard, consisting of about 500 archers under Lord Talbot, had just reached a small rise near the village of Patay when they saw French cavalry approaching in the distance. Talbot immediately understood the danger and ordered his archers to deploy. The men began frantically planting their wooden stakes and forming into lines. Each archer carried a sharpened wooden stake about 6 ft long that they would plant at an angle in the ground pointing toward the enemy, creating a fence that would impale charging horses. This was the standard defensive measure that had protected archers for decades. But planting stakes and forming proper lines took time, at least 15 to 20 minutes for a full deployment. Talbot's men had maybe 5 minutes before the French cavalry arrived. Panic spread through the English advance guard as they realized they wouldn't have time to prepare. Some archers tried to plant stakes, hammering them desperately into the ground with mallets. Others tried to string their bows, hands shaking with fear and adrenaline. A few veterans simply started running, knowing what was coming and preferring to die running than to be trampled. Lord Talbot was shouting orders, trying to organize some kind of defense, but there wasn't enough time. The French cavalry was already at full gallop, the ground shaking with the thunder of 2-0 armored horses charging at full speed. The wall of steel and horse flesh was covering the final distance. Lances lowered, and there was nothing between them and the archers. The French charge hit the English advance guard like a tsunami. Knights on armored war horses crashed into the scattered, unprepared archers at full speed. Lances punched through bodies, lifting men off their feet and carrying them backwards before the shafts broke, and the victims fell to be trampled. Horses bowled over multiple arches at once, their steel-shaw hooves crushing chests and skulls. The sound was horrific. Screaming men and screaming horses, the crack of breaking lances, the wet crunching of bodies being trampled. Archers who had spent careers killing from a distance were suddenly in close combat with armored knights, and they had no chance. The longbow carried only small sidearms, daggers, or short swords, useless against knights in full plate armor, wielding warhammers and swords. The English archers broke immediately. Those who could run did, throwing down their bows and fleeing into the woods, but most were trapped, surrounded by cavalry with nowhere to go. Knights were cutting them down from horseback, swords cleaving through the light leather armor the archers wore. One chronicler described archers being literally split in half by sword strikes from mounted knights. Others were being trampled by horses that kept charging through the mob hooves, crushing men who were already down. Some archers tried to surrender, throwing down their weapons and raising their hands, but the French knights were in a killing frenzy after decades of humiliation. They kept killing, avenging Agincourt, avenging every French noble who had died on English arrows. Lord Talbot tried to rally his men for a fighting retreat, but it was hopeless. His command group of mounted men at arms was overwhelmed within minutes. Talbot himself was knocked from his horse and captured. The English advanced guard was destroyed in less than 10 minutes. Bodies of archers littered the field, most showing the brutal injuries of melee combat. Split skulls, severed limbs, bodies trampled into the mud. The expensive long bows that had made these men the most feared soldiers in Europe lay scattered and useless. Not a single English arrow had been fired in anger. The archers had been slaughtered like cattle, unable to use their weapons, helpless in close combat against armored cavalry. The main English army, still marching in column about a mile behind, heard the sounds of slaughter and tried to deploy. Sir John Fastolf commanded this larger force, which included another 1,500 longbowmen. These men had time to prepare, and they frantically began planting stakes and forming battle lines on a small hill. But they could see the massacre happening to their advanced guard, could see French cavalry cutting down their fellow archers, and morale was already broken. French cavalry, fresh from destroying the advanced guard, and with blood up, charged the main English position before the deployment was complete. The partially prepared defenses slowed the charge but couldn't stop it. The French knights crashed through the incomplete stake line, horses jumping or pushing through the obstacles, knights striking down at the archers from above. More brutal close-quarters fighting erupted across the hilltop. Archers swung their bows like clubs, trying desperately to defend themselves against armored knights. Some managed to draw swords and daggers, but they were fighting men twice their weight in full armor. Knights were grabbing archers by the throat and lifting them off horses to stab them with daggers through eyelets or under the chin. Warhammers were caving in skulls through leather caps. The hill became a slaughterhouse. Sir John Fastolf, seeing the battle was lost, made the controversial decision to flee with his mounted retinue. He left the infantry and archers to their fate and galloped north with a few hundred mounted men at arms, hoping to preserve some fighting force. This decision would haunt his reputation for the rest of his life, but it probably saved his life. Behind him, the remaining English forces were being systematically destroyed. Groups of archers tried to form defensive circles, but French cavalry simply rode them down. Individual archers running for the woods were hunted and killed. The battle had turned into a massacre and then into a hunting expedition. The carnage continued for about 20 minutes after the main English line broke. Small groups of English soldiers held out briefly before being overwhelmed. The forest near Pat became a killing ground as French cavalry hunted down fleeing archers. Men who had spent careers killing from hundreds of yards away were dying in confused melees in the woods, stabbed in the back while running or simply trampled by horses. Some archers climbed trees trying to hide only to be pulled down and killed. The psychological tables had completely turned. For the first time in generations, French knights were dominating English longbow bowmen, and they showed no mercy. When the killing finally stopped, over 2,000 English soldiers lay dead on the field and in the surrounding woods. The vast majority were longbowmen, the elite archers who had been England's main military advantage for 3 generations. Their bodies showed the brutal reality of melee combat. Crushed skulls, severed limbs, puncture wounds from lances, and the distinctive injuries of being trampled by horses. Bodies broken and flattened into the mud. Many still clutched their useless bows. The few who had managed to fire arrows before being overrun had achieved nothing. The French cavalry had been too close, moving too fast. The longbow's dominance had been based on distance and preparation, and at Patay, the English had neither. French casualties were minimal, perhaps a few dozen men killed or wounded. The battle had been so won, cited it barely qualified as a battle, more of an execution. French knights stood on the field, surveying thousands of dead Englishmen, and could barely believe it. For the first time since the war began almost a century earlier, France had decisively defeated England in open combat. The psychological impact on French soldiers was immense. The English weren't invincible. The longbow wasn't invincible. If you caught them unprepared, they died just like anyone else. Joan of Arc, who had been with the main army during the battle, attributed the victory to God. The soldiers were inclined to believe her. The treatment of prisoners revealed how much hatred had built up over decades of French defeats. Normally, wealthy prisoners like Lord Talbot would be treated well and ransomed for large sums. But many common English soldiers captured at Patay were simply executed on the spot. French soldiers who had lost family at Agincourt or Sai took personal revenge. Some English prisoners were forced to kneel in rows and beheaded. Others were beaten to death by soldiers who had waited years for this moment. The rules of chivalry that usually protected prisoners didn't fully apply when decades of trauma and humiliation were being avenged. Only high-ranking nobles like Talbot were spared, not from mercy, but because they were worth more alive. The Battle of Patay broke the myth of English invincibility that had dominated European warfare for 3 generations. Within weeks, the entire English position in France began to collapse. French soldiers who had been afraid to fight suddenly became aggressive. English garrisons that had felt secure suddenly felt vulnerable. The psychological shift was as important as the military victory. French commanders learned that English longbowmen could be defeated if caught unprepared, and they adapted their tactics accordingly. They stopped trying to attack prepared English positions and instead focused on rapid movement and surprise attacks, denying the archers time to deploy. Within 2 months of Pi, Charles Roman II was crowned King of France at Rheims Cathedral, with Joan of Arc standing beside him. This would have been impossible without the victory at Patay, which had opened the way to Rhodes and demonstrated that French armies could defeat the English. Over the next 20 years, France gradually pushed England out of all its continental territories except Calais. The 100 Years' War, which had seemed to be ending in complete English victory, instead ended with French triumph. Patay was the turning point, the moment when decades of English dominance reversed in 6 minutes of brutal cavalry charges. The Battle of Patay stands as a perfect reversal of everything that defined medieval warfare in the 100 Red Years' War. For 90 years, English longbow bowmen had massacred French cavalry by keeping them at distance and shooting them down before they could close. At Patay, French cavalry finally caught the archers at close range and slaughtered them with the same brutal efficiency. 2,000 of England's best archers, men who had thought themselves invincible, were trampled to death, cut down, and hunted through the woods without firing a shot. The weapons that had won Cras and Agincourt lay useless on the ground while their owners died screaming. Joan of Arc's presence gave French soldiers the courage to attack, and French cavalry did the rest, proving that even the most dominant military technology can be defeated by the right tactics at the right moment. The longbow's century of terror ended in 6 minutes of pure carnage, and France was reborn in the blood of English archers who finally learned what it felt like to die helpless and afraid.